I've always been the kind of person who jumps at strange opportunities. The kind of stuff most people would think twice about. But when you've spent most of your adult life painting in your tiny apartment, you don't really pass up a chance to make good money doing what you love, even if it's a little unconventional. Think you know how this story ends? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more chilling tales. So, a couple of weeks ago, I got this call. It wasn't from some big gallery or anything fancy like that. It was just a quiet, almost awkward voicemail from a guy named Mr. Lee. He said he'd seen my work online and wanted me to paint a mural in his house. "It's private," he said, "something personal." The way he said it gave me a little chill, but honestly, I was more excited than anything. I mean, who doesn't dream about being hired for their art? The job was in this small, out-of-the-way town I'd never heard of, about a 3-hour drive from where I live. It wasn't much of a town, really, just a gas station, a diner, and a handful of old houses that looked like they'd been standing there forever. The kind of place where the trees almost seemed to outnumber the people. When I finally pulled up to the address, I couldn't help but just sit there for a minute, staring at the house. It was massive, 3 stories tall, with dark wooden panels and these strange, decorative carvings around the windows. It wasn't run down exactly, but it had that old, heavy kind of look, like it had seen more than its fair share of life. The first thing I noticed when I got out of the car was how quiet it was. Not the peaceful kind of quiet you get in the countryside. This was different, too still, like the world was holding its breath. I knocked on the door, and Mr. Lee answered almost immediately, like he'd been standing right there. He was hard to describe. Not creepy exactly, but something about him felt off. His smile was too wide, his movements a little too smooth, like he was trying too hard to seem normal. "You're here. Wonderful. Come in, come in." His voice was friendly, but it had this edge to it, like he was hiding something. Inside, the house was just as strange as the outside. The walls were covered in old wallpaper, faded and peeling in places, and the floors creaked with every step. The air smelled faintly of wood polish and something else, something metallic, maybe? I couldn't quite put my finger on it. He led me to the room where I'd be working, a long hallway on the 2nd floor. It was completely bare except for a few old chairs stacked in the corner. The walls were smooth, freshly painted white, like a blank canvas just waiting for me to bring it to life. "You'll have all the privacy you need," he said, almost too cheerfully. "I'll leave you to it, but if you need anything, I'm just downstairs." I nodded, trying not to overthink how strange this all felt. After all, a job's a job, right? And honestly, the space was perfect. Quiet, private, and more than enough room for me to let my creativity run wild. But as I unpacked my supplies and started sketching ideas, I couldn't shake this odd feeling in the pit of my stomach. The kind of feeling you get when you know someone's watching you, even though no one's there. At one point, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see Mr. Lee standing there. But the hallway was empty, just me and the sound of my pencil scratching against the wall. I told myself I was just being paranoid. New places can do that to you, you know? Make you notice every little sound, every flicker of light. But still, I couldn't help but keep looking back, my eyes darting to the edges of the room, as if something might be lurking just out of sight. By the time I finished for the day, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the walls. The air in the house felt heavier somehow, like it was pressing down on me. I packed up my tools and went downstairs, where Mr. Lee was waiting with that same too-wide smile. "Good progress?" he asked. I nodded, mumbling something about needing to refine the design tomorrow. He just smiled again, not saying much, but his eyes lingered on me a little too long as I left. When I got to my car, I felt like I could finally breathe again. The house, It was just a job, I told myself. Nothing more. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't been as alone as I thought up there. And that was only the first day. I woke up the next morning with that kind of nervous excitement you get when you're starting something new. I told myself, today's the day I'll make some real progress. The weather was overcast, a dull gray sky hanging low, which seemed fitting given the eerie vibe of the house. When I pulled up, Mr. Lee was already standing at the front door, as if he'd been waiting for me. "Good morning," he said, cheerful as ever, but his tone felt forced, like he was wearing a mask. I nodded politely and stepped inside, that strange quiet wrapping around me again like a heavy blanket. As I climbed the creaky stairs to the second floor, I noticed something odd. The hallway I'd been working on looked different. At first, I thought it was just the lighting. Maybe the clouds outside were casting strange shadows. But no, it was more than that. The sketch I'd left on the wall yesterday, the faint pencil outlines, looked smudged, almost like someone had tried to wipe them away. I stopped and stared, my heart thudding a little harder in my chest. Maybe I didn't let it dry enough, I whispered to myself, even though I knew that made no sense. Pencil doesn't smudge like that, not on its own. I tried to shake it off. After all, I couldn't accuse Mr. Lee of messing with my work. It wasn't like I'd locked the room. Maybe he'd just been curious, I thought, or maybe I was overthinking everything. Either way, I had a job to do, and I wasn't going to let a little smudge get in the way. The morning passed uneventfully, or so I told myself. I focused on outlining the base colors, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that I wasn't really alone. Every so often, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of shadow at the far end of the hallway. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there, just an empty corridor. Around noon, I decided to take a break and head downstairs for some water. As I passed through the kitchen, I noticed a door I hadn't seen before. It was slightly ajar, leading to what looked like a basement. I hesitated, feeling a strange pull toward it. Just as I stepped closer, Mr. Lee appeared out of nowhere. "That's just storage," he said quickly, his voice sharper than usual. He closed the door with a loud click and gave me a tight smile. "You won't need to go down there." I nodded, but his reaction sent a shiver down my spine. Why was he so defensive about a basement? It wasn't like I was planning to rummage through his things. Back upstairs, the atmosphere felt heavier. The air seemed colder somehow, and I could swear I smelled something faintly metallic again, like rust or blood. I checked my supplies, thinking maybe a paint can had leaked, but everything looked fine. As the day wore on, the strange occurrences started piling up. A chair that had been stacked in the corner when I arrived was now in the middle of the hallway. My brushes, neatly arranged on my workbench, were scattered across the floor. At first, I thought I might have knocked them over without realizing it, but the brushes were clean, no paint smudges on the floorboards. Then there were the sounds, faint at first, like soft whispers carried by the wind. I told myself it was just the old house settling, but deep down I didn't believe it. Old houses creak and groan, sure, but they don't whisper. By late afternoon, I couldn't ignore the feeling anymore. The feeling of being watched. It wasn't just in my head. It was physical, like an itch I couldn't scratch. My skin prickled, and the hairs on my arms stood on end. I turned around quickly, scanning the empty hallway. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my efforts to sound confident. Silence. Not even an echo. The sun had started to set by the time I decided to call it a day. As I packed up my tools, I glanced at the wall one last time and froze. The mural had changed. It wasn't a big change, just subtle enough to make me question myself. The lines I'd painted earlier seemed deeper, like they'd been carved into the wall instead of brushed on. And there was something else, a faint outline of a figure, barely visible, as if it were hiding within the colors. My hands shook as I backed away, nearly tripping over the misplaced chair. "No," I muttered under my breath. "I'm just tired. I'm imagining things." But the rational part of my brain was already screaming at me to leave. Downstairs, Mr. Lee was waiting, his hands folded neatly in front of him. "Good progress today?" he asked, his tone light, but his eyes sharp and unblinking. I nodded, mumbling something about being tired. He didn't press me, but as I stepped outside, I felt his gaze lingering on me, even after I closed the door behind me. Driving away, I couldn't stop replaying the events of the day in my mind. The smudged sketch, the whispers, the figure in the mural. None of it made sense, but one thing was clear. Something wasn't right about that house. And whatever it was, I had a feeling it wasn't done with me yet. The next morning, I woke up feeling uneasy. I couldn't shake the memories of the strange events from the day before. The smudged lines, the misplaced chair, the whispers. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was just tired. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The drive to the house felt longer than usual. The gray sky from yesterday had turned darker, and the air seemed thicker, heavier. As I parked and stepped out of the car, I noticed something strange. The front door of the house was already open, just slightly. I stood there for a moment, staring at the gap. Mr. Lee hadn't mentioned anyone else living there, and he didn't seem like the type to leave doors unlocked. "Hello," I called out as I stepped inside. My voice echoed faintly through the empty halls. There was no response, but the air felt different, colder than before, with that same faint metallic smell lingering in the background. As I climbed the stairs, I noticed something else. The hallway I'd been working in wasn't empty. A single chair was sitting in the middle of the space, facing the wall where the mural was. It hadn't been there yesterday. My stomach twisted as I walked closer. The chair was old, with scratches and chipped paint, but that wasn't the part that bothered me. It was the fact that it was turned toward the mural, almost like someone or something had been sitting there watching it. I glanced at the wall, and my heart dropped. The figure I'd seen faintly outlined yesterday was more visible now. It wasn't just a smudge or a trick of the light. It was there, clear as day, its shape sharp and distinct. It looked human, but the proportions were off, too tall, too thin, and its head was tilted at an unnatural angle. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. How could this have happened? I hadn't painted that. I hadn't even touched that part of the wall yet. "Mr. Lee?" I called out, louder this time. My voice sounded shaky, even to me. There was no answer, but I thought I heard something. A faint creaking sound, like footsteps on the floorboards. It was coming from the far end of the hallway, where the light barely reached. I turned my head slowly, my eyes straining to see into the shadows. Nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination, but every instinct in my body was screaming at me to leave. Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I moved the chair back to the corner, turned it away from the mural, and tried to focus on my work. But focusing wasn't easy. The house seemed louder today, full of faint creaks and groans that echoed through the walls. Every time I looked at the mural, I felt like the figure was staring back at me, even though I knew that wasn't possible. Then the lights started flickering. It began as a faint dimming, like the bulbs were struggling to stay on. At first, I ignored it, thinking it was just an electrical issue. Old houses have those, right? But then it got worse. The lights would blink out completely for a second or two before coming back, each time leaving me in complete darkness. During one of those blackouts, I thought I saw something move, a shadow darting across the far wall. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, but the room was empty. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. "Calm down," I whispered to myself. "It's just the house. Old wiring. Nothing to be scared of." But I was scared. The lights eventually stopped flickering, but the sense of unease didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. At one point, I turned to grab a paintbrush and froze. My brushes, the ones I'd neatly arranged on the table, were gone. They weren't on the floor either. I searched everywhere, my heart racing as I checked under the table, behind the chair, even inside my bag. They were nowhere to be found. And then I saw them. The brushes were lined up perfectly on the floor at the far end of the hallway, near the shadows. I hadn't put them there. I was certain of that. I approached them cautiously, my hands trembling as I bent down to pick them up. The air in that part of the hallway felt colder, almost icy. I snatched the brushes and hurried back to the table, refusing to look into the shadows behind me. By the time I finished for the day, I was completely on edge. Every noise, every flicker of light, every small movement in my peripheral vision felt like a threat. When I went downstairs to leave, Mr. Lee was waiting for me, just like before. His smile looked strained this time, like he was trying too hard to seem normal. "You're making great progress," he said, his voice calm but almost too calm, like he was trying to reassure me. "Thanks," I replied, barely meeting his eyes. "Let me know if you need anything," he added, but there was something strange about the way he said it, like he already knew I wouldn't ask. As I walked out to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching me. And not just the house, something inside it. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't just in my head. And I had a sinking feeling that it was only going to get worse. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure on the mural. Its twisted, unnatural shape burned into my mind. It felt like no matter how hard I tried to forget it, it was staring back at me from the darkness. By the time I returned to the house the next morning, I'd convinced myself that today would be different. I'd get through my work, finish the mural, and leave the strange job behind. But the moment I stepped inside, I knew something had changed. The air was colder, so cold I could see my breath in front of me, even though it was the middle of summer. The metallic smell was stronger now, almost overwhelming. I tried to ignore it as I climbed the stairs, but with every creak of the floorboards, my unease grew. When I reached the hallway, I stopped in my tracks. The mural wasn't the same as I'd left it. The figure had grown. It was larger now, its outline clearer, almost as if someone or something had been adding to it overnight. Worse, its position had shifted. Where it had been standing motionless before, its head now seemed to be turning, ever so slightly, toward the center of the wall. My stomach churned as I stared at it. This wasn't possible. I hadn't painted that. I hadn't touched it since yesterday. "Mr. Lee," I called out, my voice echoing through the house. There was no answer, just the same oppressive silence that seemed to swallow every sound. I tried to focus on my work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something standing behind me, but there was never anyone there, just shadows. Around midday, I decided to take a break and head downstairs for some air. But as I turned to leave the hallway, the door at the far end, the one that had always been locked, was open. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The door led to a small room I'd never seen before. It was dark inside, the light from the hallway barely reaching beyond the threshold. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay away, I stepped closer. The room was empty, but the walls were covered in strange markings, symbols and patterns that looked like they'd been carved directly into the wood. They were chaotic and jagged, like they'd been made in a hurry, and yet there was something almost deliberate about them. In the center of the room was a small object wrapped in cloth. It looked out of place, too clean and neat compared to the rest of the room. I reached out to touch it, but before I could, I heard a sound. A soft, low whisper. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. The door to the room slammed shut, the sound reverberating through the house. My chest tightened, and for a moment, I thought about running. But where would I even go? Gathering what little courage I had left, I yanked the door open and stumbled back into the hallway. The light was dimmer now, and the figure on the mural looked sharper than ever. I didn't say anything to Mr. Lee when I left that evening. He stood by the door as usual, watching me with that same too-wide smile. As I drove away, one thought kept repeating in my mind. Whatever was happening in that house, it wasn't just a coincidence. Something was trying to make itself known, and I was starting to think it had chosen me. The next day, as I parked in front of the house, the sense of dread that had been gnawing at me was unbearable. It felt as if the air itself didn't want me to be there, heavy and suffocating. The house loomed in front of me, darker somehow, like the shadows had grown deeper overnight. This time, the door wasn't just open. It was wide open, almost inviting me in. I stood by the car for a moment, staring at it, every nerve in my body telling me to leave. But something was pulling me back, a force I couldn't name, as if the house wouldn't let me walk away. Stepping inside, the smell hit me first. That faint metallic scent I'd noticed before was now overwhelming, sharp and nauseating. The floor beneath my feet creaked louder than usual, like it was groaning under the weight of something unseen. "Mr. Lee," I called out, but the words barely left my lips before they were swallowed by the silence. The hallway where I'd been working felt colder than ever, and my breath fogged the air as I stepped inside. My eyes immediately went to the mural. The figure was no longer part of the background. It was fully formed now, its body stretched unnaturally tall, its head tilted at an impossible angle. Its hollow eyes seemed to follow me, watching my every move. The colors I'd painted around it were darker, smeared and dripping, like the wall itself was bleeding. I backed away slowly, my pulse racing. This wasn't just a mural anymore. It was alive, shifting and changing on its own. Then I heard it, a low, guttural whisper coming from somewhere behind me. It wasn't a word, exactly, but it felt like it was trying to speak, like it was trying to pull me closer. I turned around sharply, expecting to see Mr. Lee, but there was nothing there, just the empty hallway stretching into darkness. The whispering grew louder, filling the space around me, echoing off the walls. I pressed my hands to my ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't just in the room. It was in my head, burrowing deeper with every passing second. I stumbled toward the stairs, my only thought to get out of the house, but before I could reach them, the door to the basement slammed open with a deafening crash. The noise echoed through the house, and I froze. For a long moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The doorway was pitch black, a void that seemed to swallow the light. And then, from the shadows, something moved. It was subtle at first, just a ripple in the darkness. But then it stepped into the faint light spilling from the hallway. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed to stretch and bend in ways that shouldn't be possible. Its face, or what should have been a face, was blank, smooth, and featureless, except for those hollow, empty eyes that mirrored the ones on the mural. I stumbled back, my chest tightening with fear. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure tilted its head slowly, as if studying me, and then it took a step forward. The sound of its footsteps was wet, like it was walking through water, but the floor beneath it was dry. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice cracking with panic. It didn't stop. I turned and ran, my feet barely touching the floor as I bolted down the hallway. The lights flickered wildly, plunging me into darkness and then blinding me with harsh flashes of light. The whispers were deafening now, a chaotic chorus of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Reaching the stairs, I tripped and fell, scraping my hands against the wooden steps. Pain shot through me, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet and ran toward the front door, only to find it slammed shut, the heavy lock clicking into place on its own. "Let me out!" I screamed, pounding on the door. Behind me, the footsteps grew louder, faster, closing the distance between us. My heart felt like it was going to burst as I turned to face whatever was coming. But the hallway was empty. The figure was gone, but the whispers remained, wrapping around me like a suffocating fog. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. The mural. The figure was no longer on the wall. It was standing in the middle of the hallway, its hollow eyes fixed on me. Its body moved with unnatural jerks, like a puppet on tangled strings. I backed away, my hands searching desperately for the lock on the door. The figure tilted its head again, and for a moment, everything went silent. Then it lunged. I don't remember much after that. Just the sound of my own screams, the cold, crushing weight of something wrapping around me, and the sudden, blinding light that filled the room. When I woke up, I was outside, lying in the dirt near my car. The house was quiet, its windows dark, and the front door was closed as if nothing had happened. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my keys, and I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. Whatever was in that house, I knew one thing for certain. It hadn't let me leave out of kindness. It had let me leave because it wasn't finished with me yet. I don't remember much about the drive home that night. The world outside my windshield was a blur of dark roads and flickering streetlights. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, my knuckles white as I gripped it like a lifeline. The air inside the car felt heavy, like the house's presence was still clinging to me. By the time I got home, my body was running on pure adrenaline. I locked the doors, double-checked the windows, and left every light in the house on. It didn't make me feel safer, though. No matter how many times I told myself I was far away from that place, the weight of it was still pressing down on me. I didn't sleep that night or the night after. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure from the mural. Its hollow eyes and twisted body burned into my mind. The whispers were gone, but in their place was an unbearable silence, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I thought about calling Mr. Lee, but the thought of hearing his voice made my stomach churn. What would I even say? "Hey, your house tried to kill me?" Sounded insane, even in my own head. Days passed, and the tension didn't let up. I started jumping at every little sound. A creak in the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, even the wind rattling the windows. Every shadow felt too dark, too alive, like it was waiting for me to turn my back. Then, about a week later, I got an email. It was from Mr. Lee. The subject line was simple: "Thank you." I stared at it for what felt like hours before I finally opened it. The message was short, just a few sentences. "I appreciate your work. The mural is complete. You've done exactly what I needed. Payment has been sent. No explanation. No mention of what happened. Just those cold, detached words." I wanted to reply, to demand answers, but something stopped me. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the nagging feeling that no matter what he said, it wouldn't make sense, or worse, it would. That night, I dreamed of the house. I was back in the hallway, standing in front of the mural. The figure was gone, but the wall was covered in cracks, like a spiderweb of fractures spreading outward. As I reached out to touch it, the wall crumbled away, revealing a dark, endless void. From the darkness, something moved. I woke up gasping for air, my chest tight and my heart racing. The dream felt too real, like it wasn't just a memory but a warning. I told myself I'd never go back to that house, that I'd put it all behind me. But the thing is, it didn't feel like it was behind me. A few nights ago, I found something strange. I was cleaning up my studio when I noticed a smear of paint on the wall. It was small, just a faint streak of red, but it hadn't been there before. I tried scrubbing it off, but the more I wiped, the bigger it got, spreading across the wall like blood. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it. Faint outline, just a shadow barely visible. But I knew what it was. The figure. It was back. I don't know what it wants or why it followed me, but I can feel it now. Watching. Waiting. Was it the house? Mr. Lee? Or something else entirely? I don't have answers. Maybe I never will. But one thing's for sure. Leaving that house didn't mean I escaped it. Some things you just can't leave behind. Ready for more chills and mysteries? Subscribe and turn on the bell. You never know what story is coming next.